Welcome to a night of total terror. Night of the living dead.
Good evening, and welcome to the very, very first edition of the Constriction Pictures podcast. Keep in mind, if we were a horror magazine or a comic book, we would be the first edition collector's edition. Or if we were a sort of up-and-coming band, this would be our limited edition 7-inch or demo tape, whatever. So first off, thank you for listening. Really appreciate it. You might be wondering, what the hell is Constriction Pictures? Let me just give you a quick little background on Constriction Pictures. It actually started as a blog about 10 years ago. Almost 10 years ago now, where I started writing about horror films. It started out as reviews of somewhat current films, sci-fi films, horror films, and then eventually it sort of morphed into me just doing retrospectives or little pieces on things that interested me, whether it was, some old horror film from the 70s or 80s, or something on A Nightmare on Elm Street, or, I even included some of my other interests in there as well. But it's something that I have been doing on and off, like I said, for about 10 years. And I've had a lot of fun with it. People seem to read it and enjoy what I write. So that's fun. That means a lot to me. Lately, probably within the last year or so, I've been listening to a lot of podcasts. The first one was The Cinescape, which is a really cool podcast about films and comic books and, pop culture, by some guys, Bill and Sean. Hey, guys. Check them out. They're really fun. And then also I've been listening to my other big thing outside of horror films is Metallica. There's a couple of really cool Metallica-related podcasts that I listen to. Metal Up Your Podcast with Clint and Ethan. That's a fun one. And also Alpha Metallica with Tom. And that one, actually, I was just on, and I sort of got bitten by the bug of doing a podcast. I, was a guest on that, on Alpha Metallica, so that was kind of cool. And then also WGON Radio, which is run by Eric and Matt. That one's sort of more geared toward George Romero and, the horror stuff, which is fun. So, big ups to all those guys for doing it. And so now I'm doing it. And also, I guess the genesis for doing this podcast really started back in July of 2017 when we unfortunately lost George Romero. He was a prolific filmmaker in the horror world, and I think also not just in the horror world, but I think he influenced a lot of independent filmmakers, probably without really realizing it. But I think if you're anybody who decides to pick up whether it's an 8mm camera or a camcorder or whatever and start filming stuff on your own, kind of owe a little bit of debt to George Romero. That's just my opinion. But yeah, the idea was to sort of do a limited series focusing just on Romero. And I wanted to, do each episode on each of his films, just go through his filmography and, talk about each movie and maybe have a couple of people on and, talk about the films as well. But then I kind of started to think, I'm like, why should I limit myself to just Romero? Why don't I just open up the floodgates, so to speak, and focus on, horror in general? Obviously I have a little bit of criteria for the films I want to talk about. It's obviously the films that I like, stuff from the 70s and 80s. That's sort of the sweet spot, anywhere from 1970 up to, 1986, 87, 88, 89, somewhere around there. Don't get me wrong, I like stuff from, into the 90s and some modern stuff. But there's just a charm that I think a lot of the stuff from the 70s and 80s have that you really can't, it just doesn't compare to stuff that comes out today. I think a lot of films try to emulate stuff from that era. And, to certain degrees, it's successful. But a lot of times it just makes me personally yearn for those types of films, those original films from the 70s and 80s. Excuse me. Also, too, I'm no expert by any means. I'm just a horror fan with something to say, and I like to talk to other horror fans. So, please, this is not this is not an educational podcast by any means. This is just me talking shop, waxing philosophically about films that I love and hopefully that you love, and so we'll go from there. Also, too, a little bit of background on me. My childhood heroes started out with Rocky Balboa, Indiana Jones, Mr. T, and then eventually this cat named Freddy Krueger. Somewhere when I was about 5 years old, I jumped into the whole Nightmare on Elm Street phenomenon. I was Freddy Krueger for Halloween when I was 5 years old. Unfortunately, there are no photos of that, though. And then I got Fangoria Presents Horror Video Number 1, which was a cool little horror video guide of just with little blurbs and reviews about all sorts of horror movies that were available on video at that point, and this was like 1988. And that magazine sort of became my Bible for all things horror. A lot of cool photos in there. I don't think at that point I really knew how to read, so I was just drawn to the photos. And then also to going to video stores, which I'll get into that a little bit later. More into that a little bit later. But yeah, also Fangoria magazine in general, I think, was sort of the famous Monsters of Filmland for my generation, and maybe even the generation before me. But definitely throughout the late 80s, 90s, I was all about Fangoria magazine, and still am. Unfortunately, it seems like we've lost Fangoria, but that's another story for another day. And then also in terms of zombies, which is probably one of my main loves in terms of horror films, Michael Jackson's Thriller. Without really realizing it, I remember watching Michael Jackson's Thriller at a very, very young age, probably not too long after the video hit MTV. Initially, I wasn't too into the zombie section of the film, short film. The Werecat definitely scared the hell out of me, but the zombies were another thing. And then also when I was 5 years old, my older cousin Tim showed me Dawn of the Dead for the very first time, and I remember him telling me, "Hey, it's got the monsters from Thriller in it." So, all right, cool, I'll check it out. Scared the shit out of me, and to this day, it is my all-time favorite film. But again, that's a story for another day. So the plan for this podcast, as you can tell right now, I'm solo today. Maybe I'll be solo for a lot of these episodes. I don't know, because as Indiana Jones says, I'm making this up as I go. Hopefully, I'd like to have some regular collaborators on. I know the two gentlemen that I have in mind, they are a little bit busy right now, so can't really do much. But together we run an Instagram account called Curated Horror, which I think you guys should check out. With that, we basically find cool photos from, or even some little videos from horror films from the 70s and the 80s, whether it's newspaper ads or cool behind-the-scenes photos, that kind of thing. And it seems, we've got a little bit of a following, and it's just something fun to do. So this is also, I guess, an extension of that, doing something a little bit more in-depth, so to speak. The basic genesis for this podcast, the idea is that, hey, it's Friday, Saturday night, we're going to the video store. We're going to be focusing on, like I said, 70s and 80s horror films, because to me, those always had the coolest covers, whether it was, a slip box, a clamshell, a big box, whatever. But possibly we could be diving into stuff from the 60s and 50s. American International Pictures is another favorite of mine, and their stuff obviously goes throughout the 60s and 50s. Also Hammer Films. Peter Cushing is a deity in my house, as is Christopher Lee. So with those types of films, I love them, and we would obviously start with the horror of Dracula, and Curse of Frankenstein, so 1957, 58. And maybe some modern stuff even too, depending on if I have particular guests on, or if somebody wants to talk about whatever movie happen to come out, hey, we can talk about it. It's all good. We might even have some special episodes focusing on certain directors or horror personalities. Who knows? Again, right now I'm staring at a blank wall, kind of making this up, like I said. But I want to get you guys involved as guests to come on and talk about your favorite horror films. Some films are on hold for some special guests, though, so I have to caution you. There's a particular slasher film from 1978 that is on hold for one of my hopeful collaborators. And then another film involving, I guess it's a bit of a blockbuster. It's from 1975 and involves a really, really big fish. That one is on hold. But yeah, anyway, let's get into tonight's film, Night of the Living Dead. So what I want to do at the start here, when I start to talk about the films, I want to break in some facts, sort of run down some facts. So budgeted at roughly $114,000, Night of the Living Dead. George A. Romero directed it, produced by Russ Streiner, Carl Hardman, screenplay by John Russo, George Romero, starring Dwayne Jones, Judith O'Dea, Marilyn Eastman, Carl Hardman, Judith Ridley, Keith Wayne. A lot of cool stuff. George Romero did the cinematography himself, edited the film himself, sound by Gary Streiner. Production company was Image 10, which I think also is sort of the blueprint for a lot of independent filmmaking too. Get your friends together, put some money together, and go out and make a film. Simple as that. The early title was Monster Flick, which was about teenage aliens coming to Earth and making friends with some human teenagers. In my opinion, it's a little bit like 50s and 60s sort of sci-fi horror stuff. It's all good. There was a second version of the script, which is about a man who runs away from home and then he comes across human corpses that aliens are using for food. That sounds like a lot of fun, too. The overall inspiration, I guess, would be from Richard Matheson's I Am Legend, which, if you haven't read that, it's really cool. Obviously, the film, it's been filmed a few different versions over the years. The most recent with Will Smith, obviously, I Am Legend. But for me personally, the best one is the Vincent Price one, Last Man on Earth, 1964. And that's a really, really cool movie. So definitely check that out. It's Night of the Living Dead is very reminiscent of it. One cool thing, too, being that it's sort of the granddaddy of the zombie film, or the modern zombie film, because obviously there were quote-unquote zombie films before Night of the Living Dead, but they weren't zombies as we know them. They're referred to as ghouls instead of zombies. The term zombie actually isn't used. Just off the top of my head, the only time I can think of the term zombie being used in any of the Romero movies would be in Dawn of the Dead, and briefly used at like one point. Ken Foray, there's going to be 1,000 zombies in here, I don't do a very good Ken Foray impression. That would be for a couple of my friends. They do a much better impression. But anyway, the script developed into a 3-part short story. Part 1 obviously became Night of the Living Dead, with Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead being adapted into the 2 remaining parts. Now, the first time I saw Night of the Living Dead would have been from my babysitter, actually, when I was in elementary school. So, gosh, I don't remember the exact year or what grade I was in. It may have been first, second, maybe even kindergarten. I don't know. But definitely at that age, when I started bringing that Fangoria horror video #1 around to her house, she took notice of my appreciation for horror, and she had an older daughter who was really into horror movies too. And I remember talking to her about Nightmare on Elm Street, and she had this really cool Nightmare 2 poster that she gave me, which unfortunately I don't have anymore, which that really bums me out. But she gave me a copy of Night of the Living Dead, and the cool thing about that was I still remember, and I still have it. I don't think I have it with me here. It's back home in New Jersey, where I grew up. But it was the Star Classics copy, and it's got a very bland cover. And on the cover, there's this image of a few of the ghouls, a group of the ghouls, which, if you're a fan of Night of the Living Dead, I'm sure you've seen this photo. It's probably the most associated photo with Night of the Living Dead, at least just off the top of my head, in terms of looking up the film in magazines or whatever. It was I guess it was a lobby card. It's a group of the of the ghouls. There's this one dude. He's got sort of a robe or a hospital gown on, and then there's another guy in the middle who's got it's like in his tighty whities, his boxer shorts, and, white undershirt, and they look freaking creepy as hell. And I remember watching it the first time, throwing it in, and I wouldn't say that I was over the top impressed, because, at that age, it was a black and white movie, and the quality wasn't the best. That's a story in and of itself with Night of the Living Dead, unfortunately, which is something I'll get into in a little bit later too. But it took a while to grow on me. I'm not going to lie and say that I, was head over heels with it initially. But I've definitely grown to appreciate it over the years, and it's definitely one of my favorite films. There's, I think too at that point, actually, let me rewind. What really attracted me to the film was the enthusiasm from my parents. They obviously had seen it, in the drive-in circuit in the 1968 into the 70s, in revivals and stuff. So they were really excited that I was, checking this movie out, and that, my babysitter had given it to me. And, so I think I, got really jazzed on their recollections of seeing the film for the first time, or, oh, I saw that on a date in the, whatever drive-in. That's pretty cool, and then the fact that, I can check it out too. And also too, as a black and white film, I got to thank both of my parents for instilling an appreciation for that. I'm definitely not one of these horror fans that, turns my nose up because, something's in black and white, or something is, a little bit older. Because don't get me wrong, I like stuff from Universal stuff as well, the stuff from the 30s and 40s and 50s. But I just have a much bigger appreciation for the stuff from the 70s and 80s. That's just me personally, Also, too, in elementary school, I would, when it comes to Night of the Living Dead, I would often have marathons of night, dawn, and day, where I would be homesick from school. Whether or not I was really sick, that's for me to know, and you to sort of wonder about, right? But yeah, I would sit there and start my morning with Night of the Living Dead, and eventually go through dawn and then day, if I didn't fall asleep at some point. But yeah, that's kind of how it started with me with Night of the Living Dead. And as I grew older, like I said, I definitely started to appreciate it a lot more. Certainly as I, went to college and took film courses and film appreciation courses and started to understand all that stuff, the film made a lot more sense and had a much bigger impact than, it's just this quote-unquote shoddy black and white film that, some crazy people from Pittsburgh made. Believe me, it's much deeper than that. And I can honestly say that I appreciate the film as definitely one of the important American films of all time. Yeah. So some of the themes that are in Night of the Living Dead, I think the biggest one is that society is collapsing. You look at 1968 in America, there's a lot of shit going on. There's a lot of racial tension. We've got the Vietnam War. We've got assassinations. It was a dark time, man. And, I don't know if Romero and company really set out to make a statement, or it just was reflected in what they were doing. You'd have to ask those guys. But I think that the characters that are in the film, I think they represent how certain people might react in a similar situation. There's sort of archetypes of characters where, you've got Ben, the calm and cool sort of guy who has a plan. and then his sort of arch rival, antagonist, Harry Cooper. He's a hothead, but he's got a plan of his own, and he likes to be the boss. Throughout the movie, he's conflicting with Ben as to who's ultimately right, and as if that's more important than staying alive. And I think some of that is addressed or touched on in the 1990 remake of Night of the Living Dead that Tom Savini directed, and a lot of obviously Romero wrote that, and I think there's a scene in there where Barbara sort of chastises Ben and Harry for arguing the whole time, arguing, bickering like children. But personally, and this is something I thought about now as I was prepping for this, to do this podcast, it kind of reminds me of discussing politics in general. Nothing's ever, there's no resolution. You got person A and person B arguing their points and hurling insults at each other, and nothing ever gets done. And personally, that's another reason why I just don't like talking about politics. It's boring, and nothing gets solved because, tears friends apart, whatever. I don't care. Then you have Helen Cooper, and Helen's an interesting character. I personally think she might actually wear the pants in the Cooper family. There's this great scene where Harry comes running down the stairs into the basement where he's barricaded his family, and he's casually mentions that the radio said something, blah, 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 And immediately Helen chimes in. There's a radio when you locked us in down here. What did it say? And she totally yells at him, and she kind of keeps his shit in check. Personally, she seems to have Harry's number, and she sort of lets him run wild and act like the childish ass that he can be most of the time throughout the film. And I always thought maybe he possibly got physical with her too in their relationship, but maybe I'm thinking too deeply about it. And also too, just to say with these character breakdowns, some of these characters, I might be going really deep here, so hold on tight, and I might be overthinking it. Who knows? Then you have Tom and Judy, and I think they're sort of, well-meaning, quote-unquote, kids. Maybe they're the seeds of the counterculture that was going on at the time. Maybe, I don't know. They seem to respect their elders, in Ben and the Coopers. And, they overall, I think they want to work together. They want to get everything done. They have a plan. They want to chime in when it's appropriate. They want everyone to get along. Although maybe Judy's not 100% on board with it, though. There's a scene where Tom asks Judy, if she can go down and keep an eye on Karen Cooper, the little girl who's been bitten. And she's kind of huffs and puffs, like, do I have to? I get it. Speaking of Karen Cooper, and this is probably the deepest that I'm going to get with the character breakdowns, she's the little girl who's been bitten by the ghouls, and she dies and ultimately kills, consumes, overcomes both of her parents. And I think there might be an allegory there, maybe about younger generations seeing through the bullshit of older generations, and here, literally devouring the older generations. Maybe it's the hippie counterculture and the civil rights activists of the 1960s overthrowing the generation that was in power at the time. I don't know, maybe. What do you think? And then obviously you have Barbara, who she's catatonic most of the time. She's got her head in the sand throughout most of the film because she really isn't saying much. She's kind of crazy. She's lost her shit. She just lost her brother Johnny. Throughout most of the movie, she's sort of an afterthought. Then she finally wants to or tries to step up and do something and make a difference, in the sort of final reel of the film, but ultimately it's too late for her. And also, then there's Sheriff McClellan and the posse. Sheriff McClellan, yeah, they're dead. They're all messed up. They're sort of the heroes. They come and save the day at the end of the movie, but they're not really the heroes because, you don't have that happy ending. Obviously, I don't want to ruin the ending to Night of the Living Dead if you haven't seen it. If you haven't seen it, do it right now, please. Do yourself a favor. If you're a horror fan and haven't seen Night of the Living Dead, what the hell are you thinking? It's important. You got to see it. But they're obvious rednecks and good old boys. And I've seen some. There's a really great documentary called American Nightmare. It came out in 2000, and it talks about films from the 60s, 70s, that sort of reflect the times that they were made in. It talks about Night of the Living Dead, and there's a little bit of criticism there, showing the juxtaposition, parallels, more so of the civil rights movement with, especially in the South, with people, with the dogs and stuff attacking these young people who are just trying to go to school. The whole end of Night of the Living Dead almost feels like a documentary with those scenes, especially with the scenes with Chili Bill Cardell showing up. And I can imagine if you were watching it on TV at the time, you'd probably think that it was real going on, which is, again, something I'll get into in a little bit too. But yeah, I'm kind of getting off course here. One cool thing too about Night of the Living Dead is almost every time I watch it, I see and I hear something new in the dialogue. One of my favorite lines in the film is from Helen Cooper, and she says, "We may not enjoy living together, but dying together isn't going to solve anything." Think about that. To me, that really says a lot about what was going on at the time. Obviously with the civil rights movement, but also with the Vietnam War and people disagreeing and people arguing and, just trying to prove their damn point. And, ultimately, I think squabbling with each other and ignoring the problem that's going on outside, which is a major thing that happens in Night of the Living Dead. I think that's a very telling quote. Whether or not, again, that was intentional, I think that's just a great quote that sums up the entire film. And what's some things that I think that are cool about Night of the Living Dead? Obviously, Johnny, who's played by Russ Streiner in the film, he's Barbara's older brother. He's kind of an ass in the beginning of the film, but he says the classic line in the film, "They're coming to get you, Barbara." I mean, come on. I mean, even the first time I saw it, I was like, "Whoa, that's a cool line." And I mean, that's been parodied to death. It sets the tone for the entire film, and I mean that's literally within the first 10 minutes of the movie, and it sets the tone, and it's I guess maybe it's sort of a throwback to stuff from the 30s, 40s that Romero and Russo might have grown up watching. I don't know, but it just to me it rules. That's a great freaking line in the film. Obviously, like I said, grassroots filmmaking, independent filmmaking. The fact that these guys, this group of friends from Pittsburgh, got together and made a film. They did it. They made a film, not just sat around and talked about it, as I've done many times, and I'm sure maybe a few of you have. But they actually did it, and that's pretty damn cool. The ghouls themselves, obviously the Romero zombie has gone through a lot of different phases and different versions, over throughout Romero's career. Personally, my favorite, and you might hear this throughout the Constriction Pictures podcast, is obviously Dawn of the Dead. That sort of blue-gray tone to their skin color, I think, that to me is a zombie, and that just scares the shit out of me. But the Night of the Living Dead zombies, they're slow. Some of them are a little faster. There's been a lot of discussion about some of the actions of some of the zombies throughout Night of the Living Dead. The Bill Heinzman zombie, the cemetery ghoul. He's the first one that attacks. Barbara and Johnny in the cemetery in the Evans City. He's a bit fast moving, but maybe he was a fresh one, as I'm sure, as I'm sure you've probably debated. But I think too that they're not quite as realized as what Romero later did or perfected in Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead, which is something that I think it's and this has happened to me personally with a couple of horror franchises where I kind of came on those trains a little bit later in the series and started with a particular, like let's say Nightmare on Elm Street 3. That to me is Freddy. Nightmare on Elm Street 4, that's Freddy. Sort of a wisecracker. Go back to Nightmare on Elm Street, the original Nightmare on Elm Street, or even Nightmare on Elm Street 2. And that's Freddy's kind of not quite there yet. And that's how I feel about the ghouls in Night of the Living Dead. They're scary, but they're not quite there yet with how they are in Dawn of the Dead, where to me they're perfect. Again, that pseudo-documentary film style throughout Night of the Living Dead. It's all mostly handheld. There's a really cool photo of George Romero shooting Barbara running away in the very beginning of the film. And, she's at this roadside, and he's standing on the road with her. He's got the camera over her shoulder filming almost right in her face. And, there's Gary Striner running sound, right behind George. And it's just a really cool shot of, a young buck shooting a movie. And, I've often heard stories, unfortunately, I can't attest to it myself personally, of people tuning into Night of the Living Dead, on late night television and being freaked out. I mean, just freaked out by, something real was going on. And, maybe it's a generational thing, where I grew up in the 80s and in the early 90s. I could kind of tell the difference between what was real and what wasn't real, but, to me that's pretty freaking cool that a movie could do that to somebody. And, definitely in the vein of War of the Worlds, where, that freaked out a whole bunch of people, right? Now, one of the things, too, that I said earlier about Night of the Living Dead, and, there's a lot of shoddy reviews and unfair reviews, I should say, of the film, that, it was made on a low budget and blah, 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 and shot with, by amateurs, which is not true. The Image 10 crew had really, at that point, cut their teeth, doing a lot of commercials, and they could do commercial films very quickly and efficiently. And I think if you look at some of George Romero's, some of the commercials that George Romero had done, which there's a short reel of some of those commercials on a few of the Night of the Living Dead DVD releases that have come out over the years. But, they were experts at what they did. And, and I don't want to get into this whole thing about the copyright issue that popped up with Night of the Living Dead, because that's not really for me to comment on. But basically, people were making their own prints and whatever, and different video companies, maybe even the Star Classics one that I first saw, were made from inferior copies of copies, and that sort of, I think, led a lot of people to believe that Night of the Living Dead was, this really poorly made film, which just isn't the case. I mean, hell, there's films from that American International Pictures put out in right around that same time that look rougher than Night of the Living Dead and more amateur than Night of the Living Dead. So I don't agree with that sentiment at all. But my main point of talking about this is very, very soon, in the early part of February, so we're probably just under a month now, Night of the Living Dead has actually been restored, and there's a 4K remaster of the film coming to Blu-ray and DVD from the Criterion Collection. And I highly, highly recommend checking this out. I know I'm definitely going to check it out. I haven't pre-ordered it because, for me, I like certain things I like going out and trying to track down on my own. It's sort of the thrill of the hunt, if you will. But I did get to see the Pittsburgh premiere of the 4K restoration, and this was back in October. We went out there for Living Dead weekend, which I'll talk about that in a little bit. But anyway, yeah, with the restoration, I've got to say, I've seen this film so many freaking times over the years, and seeing the 4K was like seeing a brand new film. And, after shooting it, or after seeing it, I had to go ask Gary Striner if, they shot new inserts or something, because there were shots that I've never noticed. And I mean, I was blown away by it. I mean, it was like seeing the film for the first time all over again. And I mean, this easily blows away any past quote unquote special edition or remaster of Night of the Living Dead. I mean, my eyes got tired from scanning every single frame of that film when I was watching it, looking for new details, or, I mean, one thing that really stood out to me that I didn't notice ever was during the sequence at the gas pump, where Ben and Tom are, kind of fighting with the gas pump that's locked, was the amount of bugs that are flying around them from, all the lights as they were filming. I've never noticed all these freaking bugs, and holy hell, man, seeing it in 4K in a theater, I was like, whoa, that's a lot of freaking bugs. Yeah, definitely check this out. It's going to be incredible. It's going to be an incredible release, and it's coming out, on its 50th anniversary. Can you believe that? 50 years of Night of the Living Dead. I mean, that's amazing. So, congratulations to all those guys, to George Romero, R.I.P., to Gary Striner, Russ Striner, Carl Hardman, R.I.P., John Russo, all those guys. I love them, and congratulations on the success, and I can't wait for this film to finally get the due respect that it deserves. Well, obviously, let me rewind. It is respected, but, to see the proper release of Night of the Living Dead. And one of the coolest things from that screening in Pittsburgh was the very end, when the copyright came up at the end of the film. The frickin' theater blew up. I mean, we went nuts, and it was gratifying. I mean, just thinking about it now, I have goosebumps, because it was so cool. And Gary and Russ and John were all still there at the screening, which was really cool too. They had done a Q&A, but seeing them afterwards and telling them, how excited we were, and just seeing their faces lit up, and it's infectious, and I think very, very cool. So yeah, Night of the Living Dead coming out in February. I don't know the exact date, but chances are, if you're listening to this, you probably pre-ordered it, and you're not like me, and you don't want to go out and just find it when it comes out, but either way, do it. So yeah, what do you think of Night of the Living Dead? I want to hear your thoughts. Comment below. Right now, this is going to be the only method of hearing Constriction Pictures will be via this YouTube page. I'm not sure how often or frequently I'm going to do episodes, because again, there's no script, making this up. So we'll see. But hopefully we'll get episodes happening and rolling, and we'll get people to chime in, and initially I've kind of reached out to personal Facebook friends, so hopefully we'll get some people to talk about episodes, and then eventually I'll open the floodgates to other listeners, and we'll get some people on board, and because I want to hear from you guys. But anyway, yeah, so thank you for listening. I appreciate each and every one of you for giving me a chance to talk about something I love, and hopefully very soon we'll catch up and we'll be able to talk about it together. All right, so thank you, and until next time, Constriction Pictures coming at you.